My name is Filipa Samarra. I'm from Portugal, and I am the founder of the Icelandic Orca Project and the researcher at the Westman Island Research Center of the University of Iceland. I'm originally from Portugal, from Lisbon. I used to really like watching TV documentaries when I was a kid, and apparently I was around 5, my parents say, when I started saying I wanted to be a marine biologist and study whale behavior. We didn't really have any kind of nature connection in the family or like someone working in that field. I just kept with that idea. So when it came time to go study at university, then I wanted to study marine biology so I could continue on this path of following this dream of being a whale biologist. I went to study in the Azores, which is this archipelago of islands in Portugal, because that's where I knew you could see a lot of whales. From there, I went then to Scotland to do a master's and PhD, and that's how I ended up here in Iceland. Initially, when I was doing my master's in Scotland, I was looking for projects that would be on acoustic communication, because that's what I really was interested in. I didn't have any specific species in mind. I was just interested in studying acoustic communication. I contacted several professors and got a reply from Patrick Miller, who was working with killer whales. So I went and I tried, and when I listened to them for the first time, I was like, they sound really cool. And then I just had a lot of questions when I finished, so I was like, I want to keep studying this species. I applied to do a PhD, and when I got the funding, my PhD was actually supposed to be in Norway. But the herring that the whales were feeding on moved away from the fjords, and we couldn't do our work anymore, essentially. And so I had to completely shift the project 1 year into my PhD. And the idea came to come and study the whales in Iceland, even though there wasn't actually any kind of work being done at the time. So we came and we explored this possibility, and it seemed like a really good place because we found a lot of whales. That's how it started. It was accidentally that I ended up here. Not as much as in Norway, because in Norway the studies had kind of started around in the 1980s. There was a long-term dedicated effort, whereas in Iceland that wasn't the case. The studies in Iceland started in the east of Iceland in the winter time when the whales were going there to feed on herring. And they were going there because at that time also killer whales were being live captured in Iceland. And so the government needed an estimate of how many killer whales there were so they could issue licenses for the live capture. And so they needed the researchers to start doing some research on the population to get an estimate of how many there were. And so that's how the research started there, and there it started with photo ID. And so that had started, and also some acoustic research, but it only lasted a few years. Then everything was opportunistic until there was kind of a bigger effort during the years when Keiko was here in the Westman Islands. At that time, there was a little bit of some acoustic data, some photo ID. So we knew a little bit. We knew that they definitely associated with herring, because a lot of fishermen would see the whales when they were fishing for herring. We knew a little bit about their unique acoustics, but there wasn't really a lot more that was known about them. The way the project started, when I came, my PhD was focused on acoustic communication. We knew they had some quite interesting signals, like this herding call. The theory that it wasn't used for communication between the killer whales because it kind of falls outside the most sensitive hearing range of the killer whales. But it's a very good frequency to affect the herring because it makes the swim bladder of the herring vibrate, and that kind of makes them kind of scared, and they just bunch together more tightly. And they use this call just before a tail slap, which is when they debilitate the herring, and then so that then they can feed on it one by one. We knew that acoustically this population was really kind of interesting to study. Initially, when I came, the only purpose really was to do my PhD research on acoustic communication. But as we started learning more and more about the population, there were more and more questions, because we were thinking, okay, we know that in killer whales, the way they feed, the diet they have, can influence so much the acoustic behavior, whether they are very vocal or whether they're silent, for example. So if their prey can hear them, they tend to be more silent. Then we realized, well, we don't know what these whales are feeding on, for sure. So I ended up the PhD with a lot more questions. I thought, oh, I want to keep doing this. I want to, do another project. And then after that, do another project. And then it developed kind of organically into a long-term project. And it was never the kind of intention from the very beginning to make it a long-term project. We started calling the project the Icelandic Orca Project when we were doing it a much more multidisciplinary. So we were looking at making a much bigger effort to the photo ID, looking at their diet and their behavior, still continuing with the acoustic communication, but we were kind of tapping into all these different areas. The goal then really became much more, okay, let's try to understand kind of a more holistic way what this population is doing. So that was the idea when we started the Icelandic Orca Project. We came to the Westman Islands first. We also had some reports of whales in West Iceland in the summer. Here we went first to Snæfellsnes for a few weeks, and then we came here for 1 month to the Westman Islands. Snæfellsnes at the time had the whale watching company doing tours in the summer, and it was a very exposed area. It just wasn't so easy to get out there and find the whales at that time compared to when we came here. So we hired a local boat, and the first time we went out we saw so many whales. That consistently kept happening that month. And so we were like, okay, this is a really good spot to study them. We decided initially to just focus here in the Westman Islands during July for our research. That was during my PhD. But then when I got the postdoc, then the herring had moved into these fjords in the Snæfellsnes Peninsula during the winter time. And people were starting to see a lot of killer whales in that area. The project we proposed was to actually do a winter and summer comparison. So the idea was to try to see with photo ID, for example, if we could see the same whales that were feeding on herring in the winter time, in the overwintering grounds of herring in the fjords of the west, and then coming here in the summer, so following the migration of the herring, which would give us much better kind of indication that the whales were specializing on herring and really following what the herring was doing. Having 2 field seasons per year was not easy. It was a lot of work. It's just the logistics of it. You have to rent housing, rent boats, find people, find housing, find all of those things. So it was a lot of work to do, and it wasn't something we thought was very sustainable in the long term, let's say. And we just focused our efforts more in the Westman Islands was that the herring moved away also from the fjords. Herring seems to be one of the main prey of killer whales, and in fact we have some killer whales in the population that we really believe are specializing on herring and really feeding on herring predominantly. Wherever the herring goes, usually the whales will follow. Herring does these migrations throughout the year between overwintering sites, then it goes on a feeding migration, and then it goes spawning in other locations, and then it goes feeding again, and then it overwinters. And that's kind of the life cycle throughout the year of the Icelandic summer spawning stock of herring. And that's the stock that comes here to the Westman Islands to spawn in the summer. And the spawning sites generally tend to be a little bit more conservative. Herring does change the overwintering migration and the locations where it goes to spend the winter. That changes then the spawning grounds. The spawning grounds tend to be more conservative. This migration of the herring and where it ends up is really important to where the killer whales are going to go. Knowing how the herring stock is doing, whether it's doing well and it's growing or whether it's declining, is likely also going to have impacts on the killer whale population. In Iceland, the diet of the killer whales that we have studied so far seems to indicate that some individuals really are kind of this traditional fish-eating specialist view that they feed on herring and that seems to be their main prey throughout their lives. But then you have these other individuals that seem to mix different prey into their diet. So they can feed on herring for part of the year, but then they will also feed on other prey, like it can be seabirds, marine mammals like seals, some target porpoises. So it can really vary a lot, and we call those the mixed diet whales. And some of those are known to also travel to other places. They go to Scotland, for example. So we've seen some matches, photographic matches between the two regions, and that's how we found that they were traveling between Iceland in the winter and Scotland in spring and summer. The first individuals that were found were actually by a colleague of ours, Andy Foote. He compared catalogs, photo ID catalogs of different regions, Norway, Scotland, and Iceland. And he had seen at that time that whales that were found in Iceland in the 1990s were then seen in Scotland. And so at the time, we didn't know if these were permanent moves, that the whales had just kind of moved to Scotland and were not coming back to Iceland anymore. And it was when we started working in the fjords in the winter time, because of course in Vestmannaeyjar we work only during the summer. So if we kept working only during the summer here, we would never have found these whales because they are not here in the summer, they're in Scotland in the summer. But when we started working in the winter, we found all these whales we had never seen before. And so part of these whales were the ones that Andy had found in Scotland some years before. And that's how then we gathered a lot of photos from citizen scientists in Scotland. And then we were able to see that actually this was happening on a regular basis. So every year they were going back and forth. And the number of whales that has been found to be matched between the two locations is growing every year. So when we see the whales that have a mixed diet in Iceland, we wouldn't be able to tell them apart from the others in terms of their behavior. They're just behaving like the others, carousel feeding, herding the herring, using tail slabs, just using the same kind of feeding behavior as the other whales. Of course, this is all from surface observations, so there's some limitations to what we can observe from the surface. But as far as we can tell, we would never be able to tell a difference between how they are feeding on herring to the others. But when they are seen in Scotland and they are, for example, harassing seals off the rocks, they are usually traveling very close to the coastline. They're trying to find seals. They're trying to wash them off the rocks. So they will move in a way to create waves even sometimes to try to wash the seals off. Their behavior definitely changes when they're feeding on one prey versus the other. So these mixed diet whales must be able somehow to kind of adapt their behavior very expertly to the different kind of prey that they are targeting. In Iceland, we don't have the same length of data collection as they have in the Pacific, where the whales have been studied for so many decades. Compared to that, we're still kind of in the early stages of being able to say what the social structure here is. And the reason for that is also because these are such long-lived animals. So you need 20 years to see a calf from the moment it's born until it kind of fully matures, to see does it stay with the mom or not, what's kind of the long-term stability of a group. When we did our first study of social structure, we only really had about 8 years of data. So it's quite short term compared to what we know in the Pacific. What it showed is that the social structure seems to be a little bit less hierarchical here. You don't seem to have this kind of like a matriline that associates with other matrilines to form a pod. You have this kind of hierarchy. It seems more fluid and a lot of social connections between a lot of different whales. And that kind of reflects what we seem to see, at least in the field, that a lot of different individuals will hang out together. There's no kind of, issues, let's say. And even whales that have, for example, a mixed diet and whales that have a diet that is very predominantly composed of herring, those whales will socialize and they will hang out, and we have multiple instances of photos where they're side by side. There's clearly associations between whales that have a lot of different, very different habits, which is not the case in the Pacific, where you have the fish-eating whales, the residents, and the mammal-eating whales, and they just do not associate. They're completely segregated socially. So already in that we see a very different picture here in Iceland. One of the groups that we know best, that we have been able to follow since the beginning, we call them the 60s. And that group we have known since our very first year, and it's one of the groups we see most often. So every year we will see them. So that group is the one of those that we have been able to follow for the longest time. And we see that when we first encountered them, the group was composed of 2 adult males, 2 adult females, and 2 juveniles, quite young juveniles. And those juveniles have now matured, and one of them is a female, the other is a male, and the female has now had her own calf and is still in the group, and they still all hang out together. So it's one of those that we are now getting enough information on that we can say, okay, it really looks like this is likely to be a family group, and they are staying with their mothers throughout their life. But we need more of these groups, we need more of these instances where we can follow groups for such a long period of time to be able to say for sure that this is what the social structure of this population is. We call them the 60s because when we were doing the first efforts of photo identification of the population, we number each whale with a code that's an alphanumerical code, so it has letters and numbers. The letters are I and S for Iceland, which is Iceland in Icelandic, and then the numbers are in the order that those whales were identified. So it doesn't mean anything about their relationship to each other. But it just so happened that we processed the pictures of the encounter where we first had, the individuals that composed the 60s. And so they all got assigned a number that was, so initially it was 63, 64, 65, 66, 67, and 68. So those were the 6 members of the group. Because they all had numbers that were in the 60s, they became known as the 60s. And that was as simple as that. Public outreach and the involvement of the public in our research is really crucial for quite a few of the things we do. Most of our field effort is based here in the Westman Islands. Only way we can study matches, for example, movements to other areas using photographic matches, is by getting pictures from other places. All the photos from Scotland came from members of the public. That was crucial for us to be able to do that study. In the same way, we recently had a study where we were given a lot of pictures from other regions of Iceland, so we could look at movements between regions of Iceland. So not just focusing on the herring grounds where we had done research before or where we are doing research now, but also looking at other regions that are not herring grounds traditionally, like in Skjalfandi Bay or in Eyjafjörður or in the West Fjords. We got pictures from these locations sent by members of the community, by whale watching guides, by people going on whale watching trips, researchers that were there. So it was a really great effort that was led by our student Tatiana, who made a massive analysis effort into looking at thousands and thousands of pictures we had from all these different regions. But it was such a nice study to do because it showed really like the willingness of all these people to contribute to find out more about the population of killer whales here in Iceland, and where do they go? Do they move between areas? Do they come back to the same area regularly year after year or not? So it really allowed us to learn a lot more about this population. The participation of members of the public is really crucial for especially the kind of research we do with movements between different regions with photos. The other thing also is we really want to show people the knowledge that we gain on this population. So we try as much as we can to do public outreach events, for example, go to schools and talk to children in schools, or do lectures for the public whenever we can. We also try to do blog posts that explain the scientific studies we do, so that other people that are not interested in reading the kind of detailed paper, they can just read the blog and kind of find out what we were doing, what we were up to. The other component also is that we have a citizen science program with the Earthwatch Institute, so where people join us for expeditions of a couple of weeks at a time during the summer, and we train them on how we do the data collection, and then they help us do the data collection while they're here. And that really helps also to share, to learn how to better communicate what we are doing. And also, actually, we learn a lot from people, because many times we are so stuck, as scientists in our little bubble. And many times it takes someone coming with a different perspective to ask a question that makes you think, oh yeah, I never thought about that. So it's, I think, a really interesting two-way relationship. It's really interesting for us also to grow as scientists, to host the citizen science program. I like it a lot because of that as well. I hope that in 10 or 20 years, the Icelandic Orca Project still exists. It is the long-term aspect of it, and the continuation of that long-term effort is the hardest thing to guarantee, because it's always funding dependent. Funding is always, an unknown. You never know if you're going to have it or not. But I hope that we can continue the effort, because I think that long-term dedicated studies are crucial to understand the lives of cetacean species, especially like killer whales that can live for such a long time. So you need that continuous effort every year, monitoring the population, getting photographs to see, is that calf still alive? Did it grow up into an adult? And is it still with the mother or not? So understanding their lives, which we need to do to really properly assess how the population is doing, then you really need those kind of multi-year, multi-decades even projects. So I hope we will be able to continue, and we will have a lot more answers. I'm sure we will have a lot more questions as well about the population. But the main questions we have right now is also related to the need to have that long-term view. For example, we are trying to understand if the fluctuations in the availability of herring, and much of this can be influenced by climate change, and we don't know how that's going to affect the whales. We think some of the whales are very specialized in herring, but because some other whales have the ability to switch diet, we don't know if that's an ability that all the whales in this population have. We know in other populations of killer whales where they are very specialized in their diet, they tend to have very serious consequences to the population, where there's increased deaths and less births if the food that they rely on isn't there in sufficient numbers to sustain the population. So what we're trying really to understand now is how strict is this kind of specialization in herring, and what happens if herring goes up and down and up and down. What happens to the population of the whales? And that you can only really start to understand if you have this long-term perspective. So I hope that we can continue the long-term effort, so that we can also gain a bit more knowledge, and that will help us also predict in the future, with climate change effects, how resilient is this population to changes in the environment. Because we know other populations of killer whales are so conservative in their behavior that they might not be very resilient. But what is the situation with this population? Do they adapt if there's not enough of one prey, that they feed on another, or do they also suffer these consequences? So that's the main kind of area that I'm really keen to explore more. My first moment that I had that was my very first field season with killer whales in Norway, where I felt really like, I had this childhood dream of becoming a marine biologist. And I had moved away from home at a very young age when I went to university. I was 17 and I moved away from my home in Lisbon to go to the Azores. I had then moved again to Scotland and I was doing this field work in Norway, and it was the first time I was seeing snow and all these things. And at that point I remember having a moment thinking, okay, I actually am living the dream. This is really cool. But since then there have been just so many moments out at sea when you're like, okay, this is like, you're telling yourself, you're very lucky to be doing this. You're like, yeah, this is a pretty cool job to have.